This is the story where the Beanie Man came from. This book is called The Boy from 9 Mile, The Early Life of Bob Marley by Cedella Marley, Gerald Houseman, and art by Maria Fox. Nesta Robert Marley was born in the village of 9 Mile in the parish of St. Anne, Jamaica. His mother, Siddy, was so proud that February morning, and so were his grandfather, Omariah, and his grandmother, Alberta, in whose house Nesta opened his eyes to the world. On the windowsill in the warm winter sun, 3 little birds came to sing their sweet songs. "It is a sign," said Siddy. Omariah, who was known all around as Seer, nodded and said, "I think that a new day is dawning." And the song of the 3 little birds and the news of the birth traveled throughout the hilltop of 9 Mile. When Nesta was 5 years old, he worked every day in the planting fields with his grandfather. They would set out with pail and hoe in the early morning sun, and always as they walked up the rumbled hills to the farm, Nesta asked, "Where is my daddy today?" And Omariah replied, "Oh, your father is wearing his tall boots somewhere." To Nesta, this meant that Captain Norval Marley was riding his great white horse and doing great work in the service of his country. In truth, Nesta had only seen his father once, and never so close that he could rest his eyes upon him easily, or call him by his name. Never once had he said "Daddy" to the captain's face. Moreover, he could not imagine doing so. Young Nesta soon forgot about his absent father. Instead, he thought about the man he knew and loved, his grandfather, Omariah. Together, the two worked under the shade of Omariah's large straw hat. They weeded and widened the rows of corn, yam, and potato, and all the while Omariah spoke of things to the boy liked to hear, and Nimble the donkey snorted in the shade and twitched his ears. Amidst the song of grasshopper and cricket, Nesta listened while his grandfather spoke deep and clear, and his hoe clinked against the stones. In the risen sun he told Nesta of African kings and biblical patriarchs, and these legendary folk rose taller than the tallest clouds as they cast long blue shadows across the green, folded ground of 9 Mile. While Omariah told stories, Nesta saw Goliath grow out of a thunderhead in the sky, and Nesta imagined that he was David. When the cloud crumbled away, another appeared in its place. The next one was Samson, charging the Philistines with a donkey jawbone, clutched in his hand. One day Omariah was telling of the 3 men who jumped out of the fire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When up the street red road came a high-booted man on a big white horse. Nesta was thinking of the fire jumpers who outwitted the king. Nebuchadnezzar, for a moment, the king Nebuchadnezzar. For a moment he failed to see that the horseman was his father, Captain Marley. That night when Siddy tucked Nesta into his bed, she told him what his father's visit was all about. "My precious boy," she said, "you are going to get a wonderful opportunity. You are going away to school." Nesta drew a deep breath. Then he asked, "When, Mama?" "Tomorrow," she said, stroking his head. She smiled as if the certainty of this thing were carved in stone. "Will I leave 9 miles?" Nesta asked, and Siddy replied, "Yes, child, It is all arranged by your father. You will get your schooling in Kingston. There you will learn to read and write and speak proper English." Nesta's eyes filled with tears, but he did not cry. He saw the look in his mother's eyes, and he knew there was no sense in trying to talk her out of it. The thing was done, and his father had done it. Sometime after the kerosene lantern went out in the next room, Nesta lay awake. The sleeping house dreamed, but little Nesta tossed and turned. He did not want to go to Kingston. Most of all, he did not want to go with his father, the stranger who wore a uniform and who called him Robert, and whom he never called Daddy. In the muffled stillness of his grandfather's house, Nesta closed his eyes and a vision came to him. He saw a pale rider come over the high hill on a pale horse, and that man was Sorrow. Down the hill into the village the sad horseman came, and the hoofs of his white horse echoed against the houses. When he opened his eyes, it was morning. Siddy laid out his traveling clothes, clean overalls, a crisp cotton shirt, and something he never wore at all, shoes. These he put on with some difficulty. They felt terrible and hot on his feet. When Alberta placed a bowl of cornmeal porridge in front of Nesta, he ate it in silence, watching the John Crows float lazily past the open window. After finishing his breakfast, Nesta went outside where Omariah gave him a stick of fresh-cut sugar cane to take with him on his trip. Nesta thought of all the mornings with Omariah, and a tear slid down his cheek. Quickly he wiped it away. Omariah said, "Do not look so cast out, Nesta. Go like David into the lion's den, fearful of nothing and with nothing to fear." Omariah rubbed Nesta's head, and altogether the family walked up the red road to meet Captain Marley at the bus stop. The captain was waiting for them, but he was not atop his white horse. Right away Nesta noticed how polished were his boots, but he did not dare to look into his father's eyes. Yet neither did the tall man look down into his. Perhaps the heavily packed country bus bumbled round the corner and ground to a stop. A cloud of rust-colored dust came up from the road and settled on the bus and all the people in it. Captain Marley grabbed Nesta's hand and swept him up onto the bus. Nesta found himself smothered in the noise of neighbors and strangers. Outside the bus, Omariah, Alberta, and Siddy waved goodbye. Omariah said, "Walk good." Alberta reminded, "No forget your manners." Siddy reached through the open window and touched his hand. She was crying, and Nesta cried out to her. The bus lurched forward and started to leave. Captain Marley's hand tightened. Then all that Nesta knew and loved went away like a summer's dream. 9 miles was lost to sight. The paths and gullies that Nesta had traveled upon with Nimble wound away and were gone, and 9 miles was no more. Kingston. Nesta's eyes stayed on the road, as if it were his only friend. He watched the surface change from dirt, which he knew well, to tar, when he did not know at all, and finally, after that, the road changed to a total stranger just like his father. It was rocky, roundabout, up, down, and all around. A thing of potholes and rain pockets, and so many twists and turns that Nesta could not count them. While the bus raced downhill toward Brownstown, Captain Marley never moved. His body, big and hot, was pressed against Nesta, who, tiring of the scenery, soon fell asleep. When he woke, the bus had stopped. They had arrived in Kingston, and the city lay harshly and brightly before them. Nesta could not believe how large it was. Wherever he looked, the tenement jungle blotted the mountains, and the air was stifling. Yard smoke clotted the streets, and Nesta's nose stung with the odor of burning rubber. The sun shone hard and clear, but it could not burn through the ashen haze, the dark daylight of Kingston. Captain Marley led Nesta through a boiling sea of staring faces. Here was a world Nesta had never seen and could not imagine. As Captain Marley pulled him out of the way, two baggedy boys came by with their wooden handcarts of water, coconuts, ices, and bulla breads. A fierce clamor rose up. All around them, people pushed and bumped and shoved. Nesta felt small and unimportant beside the tall man who pulled him along through the crowd. Wherever Nesta looked, he saw filth, trash. The gutter ran with inky seepage. "Mind your shoes," Captain Marley ordered as he plowed down a narrow lane. Now the clatter of Spanish Town Bus Park fell behind him. They walked on. When Nesta slowed his pace, Captain Marley increased his. The military march continued until they came to an unpainted, rough-boarded cottage on a dark, dead-end street. It started to rain. Captain Marley went up the stairs of the cottage, and for the first time he let go of Nesta's hand. Then he rapped on the door, and a sad-eyed woman greeted them. Without asking, Nesta knew that this was the place where his father was going to leave him. However, he could not imagine the big-booted captain staying in such a small, dingy house. "I am Mrs. Gray," the old woman said. Nesta stood still as a post. Mrs. Gray, he thought, had a tired, kind face, but he did not want to go into her house, which even from the open door had a bad, mildewy smell. Captain Marley exchanged a few words with Mrs. Gray. He put an envelope into her hand, then, nodding briefly to Nesta, he turned and descended the stairs and walked down the rainy street. Nesta stood alone with Mrs. Gray. His father faded into the rain and gloom. Mrs. Gray led Nesta inside. The cottage smelled of musty wood, old rotten cloth, and kerosene oil. "This is where we're supposed to stay?" Nesta asked. Mrs. Gray answered, "Just you. Your father has his duties elsewhere." Nesta did not want to go any further into the strange, dark cottage, but Mrs. Gray led him along the narrow until unlit hall to the kitchen out back. There, under a rain-beaten zinc roof, she took a black pot off the fire and gave Nesta a bowl of pumpkin soup. As the rain banged down, he ate hungrily, wondering what city Omaria and Alberta were doing, and whether it was raining back in 9 Mile. That night, Nesta slept on a kaya mattress in the same room as Mrs. Gray. The rain kept on, and as he lay in the unfamiliar bedroom, he dreamed of ragamuffin beggars with hollow, graveyard eyes and old faded men with scraggly, fishbone beards. But mostly, he had visions of his father in his brass-buttoned uniform, dark pressed pants, and tall, shiny boots. Yet, in the dream, the captain had no face. The dream changed. He saw himself riding nimble, with his arms around the little donkey's neck, and the song of the crickets in his ear, and Maria walking close by. The next morning when Nesta woke up, Mrs. Gray was too sick to get out of bed. "Run a market and come and carry rice and gungopi," she said feebly from her pillow. Nesta, all at once, was caring for the person who was supposed to be caring for him. But he followed her directions and ran to the nearby market she told him about. There he saw higglers, with their goods spread out for all to see. Huge, rough yams, strings of tangerines, hard green limes, June plums, knobberries, soursop, sweet sop, oranges, ackee, kalolo. All these reminded Nesta of where he was from, the country. He loved the market not just because of the fruits and vegetables, but because of the music. The higglers did not only sell their things, they sang about them. "Hey boy," sang a little beanie man, "touch me tomato, touch me yam, pumpkin, potato." On the way back to Mrs. Gray's cottage, Nesta saw a Blackheart man. He had seen them before, of course, up in the hills of St. Anne, but this one, with his long, ropey locks and fiery eyes, was living under the bridge in a hut made from a packing crate. There were plenty of tales in 9 Mile about the Blackheart man who stole your soul and carried it away in a crocus sack. Yet this dreadlock person was soft-spoken and nice, and when Nesta passed by his place, the Blackheart man gave him a doctor bird woven from a piece of coconut leaf. In the days and weeks that followed, Nesta grew quite independent. There was no question of his going to school. Mrs. Gray was too sick to be left alone. As the weeks turned into months, she got steadily worse. Finally, she was bedridden almost all the time, and Nesta was her only caregiver. However, he learned to do everything: cooking, cleaning, marketing. It was the last thing he liked first and best, because always, when he went to the market, there was the beanie man who taught Nesta new songs. One day, Beanie Man taught Nesta how to make a tiny one-stringed instrument out of a sardine can. Another time, he taught him how to shape a cigar box into a guitar. The strings were made of palm twine, and they made a sweet sound when you plucked them. But it was not all music on market day. Much of what Nesta saw was a hardship. Sometimes people fought over food, and some were really good at stealing it and running away. So Nesta learned the truth of Omariah's saying, "Rain does not fall on one man's house alone." He saw that everyone in Kingston was up against the same hard wall of poverty. No one was exempt from it. Being poor was the one thing that bound each to each and all to all. Poverty, Nesta realized, stalked the streets of Kingston like a dragon, and right along beside it went the devil of hunger. One night, after a long, hard day at market, Nesta dreamed that he was living in the ancient city of Babylon. There the rich lived on top of the poor and pressed them down like swollen grapes into the earth. Nesta woke that morning with a terrible, uneasy feeling, and he longed to be back in the sweet hills of St. Anne. In the time that passed, Nesta was always by himself. Yet there was never a day, nor even an hour, when he did not think about City, and he never stopped wondering what Omariah and Alberta were doing. Whether the melons were ripening and the corn turning golden, whether Nimble was sure-footed as ever, but where was Mama City? Often when Nesta was daydreaming, he had visions of City. She was always standing there, looking right at him, saying, "Nesta, my child, where are you?" He would snap out of it, hardly aware that it was a daydream. His sight was so clear and the picture of his mother so real. Occasionally Nesta had thoughts of Captain Marley, whom he imagined as he last saw him striding roughly through the rain, but the captain did not pay him a visit, not once. One day when Nesta had been with Mrs. Gray for about a year, Siddy walked into the yard as if she had been doing so every day since the beginning of his stay in Kingston. Nesta could not believe his eyes. "Mama, you finally come!" He ran and hugged her, and she hugged him, and there were tears in their eyes, and in his too. Mrs. Gray came trembling to the open door, leaning on her cane. Siddy shook her head and said angrily, "I have been looking for my Nesta up and down, ever since Captain took him away, kidnapped him." Mrs. Gray protested. "He did no such thing. He intended Nesta to go to school." She lowered her eyes and added, "I've been too sick for that." Siddy gave her an unforgiving stare. "It's not what you intend to do, it's what you do," she said, holding Nesta tight in her arms. Then she looked Mrs. Gray deeply in the eyes and said, "So why you never write me about my son?" For a moment Mrs. Gray was speechless. Then she asked, "How did you find my house?" Siddy replied, "A friend of ours, Maggie James, saw Nesta walking on Spanish Town Road just yesterday. She told me and I came here at once. And I asked all around where Nesta lived, and no one seemed to know. Then a Blackheart man living down by the bridge said, 'I know that boy. It was him who brought me to your yard.'" Mrs. Gray sighed. "I never thought Captain would keep my house so secret." She smiled weakly and said, "Nesta has been a lifesaver for me, and I don't think him any worse for the wear." "Let me look at you, child," Siddy said, as she held Nesta at arm's length. He was taller and older, and somehow he seemed wiser, something in his eyes. She wondered if this was what city life did to a country boy. Nesta looked like a little man, a boy still, but there was something so grown up about the way he stood, so straight and tall and sure of himself. Mrs. Gray had spoken the truth when she said that Nesta was no worse for wear. "Can we go home now, Mama?" Nesta asked. "Yes, baby," she said. "We are both going home now." And that was what they did. The two of them took the country bus back to 9 Mile, home to Omaraya in Alberta, home to Nimble, home. "Prodigal son return," Omaraya laughed when Nesta got off the bus and stepped into the 9 Mile twilight. Here the croaker lizards were croaking, the rat bats were flying, and the frogs were singing. Nesta, one hand in Siddy's and the other in Omaraya's, was glad to be alive, grateful to be home. "Some people, Mama," he said as she tucked him into his own bed that night, "don't have a bed." Siddy nodded and Alberta and Omaraya smiled. They looked knowingly at Nesta, who went on, "Even if you have a rock stone for a pillow, that could be your bed." "Heavens!" Alberta exclaimed. "You have grown so. Are you going to be a wise man now?" "I am going to be a singer," Nesta smiled. Siddy asked him if he knew any songs, so Nesta sang the song he had learned from the beanie man at the market. "Hey, Mr. Touch Me Tomato, touch me pumpkin and potato." Siddy laughed, so did Omaraya and Alberta. Omaraya asked, "How do you know you're going to be a singer?" "Three little birds tell me so," Nesta answered. But whether he was dreaming, teasing, or just talking, no one really knew, for by then he was already asleep. Yet the next morning he sang his favorite songs on Nimble's back as he and Omaraya went to the farm, and from that day on he never stopped singing.